Welcome to Sahitya Academy's Webline Literature Series, and today's program is in English language. Today we have a panel discussion on speculative fiction in Indian literature. Speculative fiction is a category of fiction that contains within it a lot of elements, basically that has how to do something to do with some things which are no, it doesn't exist in the real world, maybe supernatural, fantasy, and of course science fiction also is classified under this. And then when we talk about India, we have from the times of Puranas, we have had fantasy, supernatural, horror stories involving creatures that are not humans. In the modern India also, in all the languages, we have had Indian fantasy, fantasy and science fiction. And I don't know, Bodhisattva can confirm, and I read somewhere that Hemlal Datta is the first person in India to write a proper science fiction story. It appeared in 1882, but then we have in Kannada, Tamil, all the languages, we have all these science fiction stories later and throughout 20th century. Today, if we look at it, it's mind-boggling. The number of people, young people who they have taken up to fantasy and science fiction is phenomenal. You know, I mean, when we count not only in English and other Indian languages, but maybe 30 years ago, roughly, yeah, around maybe 40 years ago, with the arrival of speculative fiction that in Indian English, that we saw a huge interest among public in this speculative fiction. So, like, for example, we have quite a phenomenal amount of works. There's no time for us to go through each and every name. One is, all of us know that Calcutta Chromosome by Amitav Ghosh, for which he won Arthur C. Clarke Award. Games World Trilogy by Samit Basu. And then very interesting book, Kurali Manika Whales, Insects are just like you and me, except they have wings. And then we have one of our panelists, The Beast with 9 Billion Feet by Anil. And then, of course, Shweta Taneja's book, and then Escape on the Island of Lost Girls by Manjula. And then Vandana Singh is here. We have to mention, everybody talks about, I went through a lot of features, and everybody talks about ambiguity missions and other stories, but people conveniently or inconveniently, they forget the woman who thought she was a planet and other stories. That is, I don't know, that is some kind of a remarkable work. But these are all urban-based writers who are all this kind of a fantasy, literary fantasy, science fiction and all. But of late, we are seeing some kind of a revival, some kind of a going back to mythology, to Puranas. And well, all of us know the very popular eminent works, but it's a couple of 2 or 3 interesting works that are Sukanya Venkataraghavan's Dark Things, which was published in 4 years ago, that talked about the Yakshi falling in love with a man and facing a fight with, having a fight with the goddess. And then in Immortal, Krishna brought I'm talking about Krishna Uday Shankar, he brought Ashwatthama as a modern professor. And of course, Anuja Chandramauli's Agni coming back as Yama's lieutenant and all that stuff, so on and so on. So today, this is a very interesting topic. It's a very broad-based topic. But to discuss this, we have a very distinguished panel here with us. And Ms. Manjula Padmanabhan, she joins us from United States, and she's author, playwright, cartoonist. Her play Harvest won in 1997 Oasis Award for Theatre in Greece. Her weekly comic strip, Sukiyaki, appears in Business Line. Her books include, just now I mentioned, Escape and The Lost Girls. Sorry for that. Okay. And then it's a great to have you with us, Manjula. Thanks for joining the show.
Thank you for asking. So would you like me to start, or will you introduce the other panelists?
Just 2 more panelists. Bodhisattva Chattopadhyay is assistant professor in global cultural studies at the Department of Culture Studies in Oslo. And he's a leader of 2
associate professor.
Okay, associate professor. Yeah. Okay. And European is an two international projects is handling on science fiction. The European Research Council projects Co-Futures, Pathways to Possible Presence, and the Norwegian Research Council project Science Fiction Fictionality. He is an expert in global science fiction and futures, and is the recipient of several awards for his work on science fiction. He has worked extensively on Indian science fiction and Chattopadhyay. He is author or editor of 7 books on the subject. His project website is, those who are interested, cofutures.org. It's a pleasure to have you with us, Bodhi.
Thank you. Pleasure being here. Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, our other panelist is Anil Menon. His most recent work is Half of What I Say. It was published by Bloomsbury 5 years ago, was shortlisted for 2016 Hindu Literary Award. I was there for that particular moment. His debut novel, The Beast with 9 Billion Feet, I just mentioned, was shortlisted for 2009 Crossword Prize and Call Back to Society Parallax Award. His stories have been translated into more than a dozen languages, including Hebrew, Romanian, and Igbo. And he has a forthcoming publication of speculative fiction to be published probably fall this year by Hachette India. So it's great to have you, Anil, with us.
My pleasure. Yeah.
Just hold on before running. Okay. Okay, Keki has joined, and okay. Now I will start with Manjula. You please go ahead, Manjula.
Okay, thank you. Thank you all for being here. Thank you, Raj Mohan and the Sahitya Akademi for inviting me to be a speaker. And I'm very conscious that the others amongst us are probably better equipped to be on this panel, but I will do my best. I wanted to say a little bit about my introduction to science fiction. It was probably in the early 60s. I was not yet a teenager. And the first book I read was by Robert A. Heinlein, Have Spacesuit Will Travel. And we were living in Thailand at the time, my parents and I, and we had TV, and I watched Twilight Zone on TV and Outer Limits and Lost in Space, and these were my introduction to science fiction. By that time, I was old enough to have wondered why in the children's fiction I read at the time, I was not seeing Indian characters or characters who look like me, and whether Indian or not. I think it was a good 10 years though, later when I was in the US and was exposed to Star Trek, that it occurred to me that Star Trek was full of aliens, and the spaceship off Star Trek had a range of humans, and some aliens, but there were no recognizable Asian characters. And I began to, question, are Asians so alien that we can't even appear in a futuristic science fiction series? But it was, I have to pause to say that thoughts about culture and science fiction are, one has to ask oneself where the colonial impulse enters this issue, because we have to be aware that there is an attitude, an aspect of colonizing the future of not just the future, but the past and many time zones and many galaxies, many dimensions, when we enter and we place our either personal flag or cultural flag. Now, whether we think of it as an actual form of cultural colonization or not, the fact that so much science fiction in the in the early 20th century involved people who did not look like us, so that even in the current world, when we see, at least when I see science fiction which includes people who look like us, I'm amused and somewhat saddened to see that we are typically somewhat caricatured. And I would like to think that when we write our own versions of science fiction, we might find it possible to overcome that. Now, I was fortunate enough to be asked to be the editorial assistant of to Tarun Saint with the first Golang's book of South Asian science fiction last year, and we're working on a second book. It was a very refreshing and interesting experience to see the range of subjects that were approached and the ideas that were addressed. But I attempted, and I'm not even going to try to give you a piece by piece breakdown, but I attempted to do a kind of schematic. And I would say that with the first book, there was a broad spread of subjects, but I was looking for mood. And I would say that the overwhelming mood was in the range of melancholy, thoughtful, hopeful, with some satire. This year, by contrast, the overwhelming range, the overwhelming percentage, more than half, are about either definitely political and sociological political pieces. From around the region, we have a better spread of other countries in the second volume. The interest and the concern about the freedoms of thought and action in the future are really remarkable. It's really worth recognizing that, at least going by science fiction stories, these are the issues that are animating writers who are working in the field today. Rajmohan, I don't know whether I've filled up my 5 minutes.
Yeah.
But I'm going
let us hear from Bodhisattva. Bodhi, please unmute yourself. Yeah.
Yeah. Hi. Thank you. No, Manjula just gave us some of the richest thoughts, really. And also, thank you very much for bringing up Star Trek, because I think Star Trek is kind of a common reference point for a lot of fans, because that's kind of the first thing that they saw. I grew up with Next Generation, for instance, and I always like, okay, Next Generation is kind of my show, and Picard, so on.
Yes.
I just finished writing a paper on Star Trek and language and communication, in fact. And I completely agree with you that that has kind of been the point with Star Trek as well. And with each show, they have tried to make it a little bit better in terms of diversity or people who look different, or people who even look like us, I would say. Yeah, they haven't always done a good job of it, but they have tried. But certainly, I mean, in my own work, I was also quite inspired by Star Trek, in fact, in many ways, in imagining a kind of a possible future in which, humanity would finally get along and get along well enough to go to the stars, right? And that is, I think, the hopeful core of Star Trek, in a way, has been quite influential for a lot of Indian SF fans as well. For instance, Sami Ahmed Khan and I often have a conversation on Star Trek. He's also a big fan. He's also a writer of science fiction. He's not joining us here today, but is based in Delhi. So I think what, and this is kind of where I think a lot of contemporary SF, including SF from India and SF from around the world, is increasingly coming into kind of this tension with, I would say, Anglophone SF. And that is questions of diversity, questions of race. How do you treat that? And I think that we have a lot of dystopian SF that is common around the world at the moment, but primarily in Anglophone SF, but also specifically within climate fiction, environment fiction, and so on. There's a lot of dystopian narratives happening there. But I think that within at least what I would call the space of global South SF, there is a lot more optimism, and I can kind of understand why Volume 1 would be in a way different from Volume 2, because within Afrofuturism, for instance, or within Indian SF and Latin American SF, for instance, there is a lot more hope. And that is hope in spite of everything. That is hope in spite of the destruction, in spite of the chaos, because we have lived with that. And I know Samit has this wonderful phrase. He said, well, dystopia for us is Tuesday. So we have to think, beyond it. So, like something like Margaret Atwood's Handmaid's Tale is pretty much a white person's dystopia. In our part of the world, well, we know these things happen, and we have to imagine something beyond that. And science fiction or speculative fiction becomes a way of thinking beyond that. And I think that this is going to be increasingly true of us, true of Indian SF, and true of SF from the global South in general. Yeah.
Okay. So we'll, we'll get back to you, Bodhisattva. Anil.
Yeah. Well, I'd like to begin. I'd like to echo Manjula and thank you, Raj Mohan, for inviting me, and Tarun for putting us in touch, actually.
Yeah.
And it's good to see all these familiar and beloved faces. I've known these people for a while.
Professor Malashri Lal just joined us. Malashri Lal is there.
Hi. So actually, in tracing, thinking back to when I got started with this whole thing, what I find is I used to read pretty much everything that came my way. I was like a goat. I would eat anything. And so today I would be reading War and Peace, and tomorrow it would be Harold Robbins. I didn't really understand the difference between various genres, and there are people who read certain kinds of novels and people who don't. It was basically anything that was available was up for consumption. But I do remember one story that struck me as very different in the sea of stories. And that was, I think, Ray Bradbury's Sound of Thunder. And in this story, which actually echoes the butterfly effect, a man goes back in time, kills a butterfly, and he finds when he comes back, the whole world is changed. But this idea can be found even in one of Jagdish Chandra Bose's story, where a small change stops a storm.
Yes.
But I remember this story in particular, it felt very different. When I read it, it wasn't like any other story that I had read. It was my first science fiction story, actually. And I remember that it's like that butterfly had died. Something had changed in me as well. So I began looking out for these stories. And when I think back to those days, I think what I noticed is that I used to find ideas more interesting than people. Perhaps it was the engineering training, perhaps it was the milieu in which I was, but ideas were far more important. And science fiction caters to literature of ideas. It's much easier to discover an idea, the exploration of an idea in science fiction than in other forms of literature. So it became something that I pursued actively, perhaps even exclusively for a few years. When I began writing, I was naturally writing the kind of stuff I was reading. And so Beast to 9 billion feet was one such effort. I do remember that when I wrote Beast 9 billion feet, one of the motives was to explore a world in which we could vote with our feet. So you didn't like a particular setup, you could find some place in the world where you would have your kind of people. So I imagine a world of artificial islands where you could try out different societies, which is one thing that I think we are sorely missing today. In the 19th century, we used to have all these small utopias being built all over the world. And today we find it much harder to establish your own little space in which you can try out social, political, technological ideas. So that was the motive for Beast to 9 billion feet, the story of one such island. But a funny thing happened. As I continued writing, I began to find people far more interesting than ideas. And I think that's when I began to shift towards kind of away from science fiction and more towards the other forms of speculation that kind of, you're not trapped in the world of ideas. You can, for example, look at text. You can look at our relationship to nature in a way that people are involved, not just the ideas of environment or the ideas of climate change or the ideas of freedom. So these days, especially, it's a question of uh, when you tell a story, what should be the human focus be? Um, and I think we have gone from the modernist uh, age in which we should focus stories all over. They were all about consciousness, representing consciousness in one form or the other. Then we went to the postmodern stage, where it's all about experimentation, and the whole thing is about uncertainty, in which everything you believe in is maybe up for grabs. The questions of self, questions of identity, questions of the relationship between text and context. All these things are up for grabs. And today we are kind of moving into a world in which we have to find like new stories as to give meaning to our lives. And so at the moment, that's what the kind of thing that I'm exploring. So I see speculation as much larger, much larger than science fiction itself. Uh, and speculation is one of those things in which one day it will have the weight that the word fiction has. Just as we say fiction and non-fiction, I think the word speculation one day will have that weight, that significance, that amount of study that we devote to fiction, we will devote it to the word speculation as to what it really means to let the imagination come into literature. So the simplest way of defining speculative fiction for me would be, it is a true literature of the imagination. And wherever the imagination goes, this form of fiction is willing to go, rather than constraining it, curtailing it, focusing it on special interests. That's where I'm at. So I look forward to listening to what others people have to say. Yeah. And let's get the conversation started.
Yeah. Manjula, that one observation of yours, when we go back to, and then echoed by Bodhisattva also, that more and more the characters not looking like us humans. So basically the very grain, fundamental element of speculation is that to grow out of this humanness, something beyond us, overcoming a man. So as such, it is not some kind of a constriction if we try to anthropomorph everything.
I won't, there's that discussion can go in so many different directions. But I believe the power of science fiction is that it opens the mind to the possibility of going to other spaces, other concepts of selfhood and living ideas. And when I have a number of friends who don't like it that I write science fiction, because there is an underlying view that science fiction, at least amongst people who don't read it, that it's a kind of adult fairy tale. And I fiercely object to that and reject that, because I believe in its science fiction allows us to travel into spaces that are not necessarily physical, but we travel with intention and with hope and with ideology. And for me personally, as a writer of science fiction, I find that it frees me to be something other than this person. I can travel not just through time and space. I can travel through other characters in a way that is not really offered by standard fiction, non-science fiction. And one can, the plasticity of human imagination is given full rein. So it doesn't, if someone wants to write fictions about through the consciousness of a lizard or some as yet unknown creature, they're welcome to do that. But we still got to use the methods of expression that we have, which is the languages we have. So, I mean, that again opens up a whole other notion of selfhood, because languages themselves are so embedded with ideas of for instance, gender. I mean, different languages have different concepts of gender. And I'm very conscious, for instance, that in English, we have the option of a neuter gender, but so many languages do not. And I often wonder, if you don't have a neuter gender, do you, in the first place, think of the world as divided into two? Or does it really mean that those who speak English really use gender only for sexual reasons? Whereas those languages which have only two genders, and those genders are spread across and inanimate objects, have maybe a more generous notion of genderhood. So I'm just raising this as just one among so many ways of experiencing life and our presence in the world, and that science fiction offers us so many different ways of opening up the box of self.
Oh, that's great. Bodhi, think that you are one person here who is at least looking after dealing with speculative fiction, science fiction across countries. So where, which point do you think that, especially in even in developing countries, where it all started? I thought it is speculative fiction, science fiction, fantasy writing in English, which brought all the focus, and the public, masses got interested in India. So where do you think worldwide, especially even in Africa, I read somewhere that Kenya, it's a craze actually there. So where do you think it all started, this kind of a mass interest in this kind of speculative fiction? Earlier it was, kind of a thing which is elites used to have dabble in that.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. I think that's such a difficult question to answer in a way, and I would like to pick up from both what Anil said earlier about speculation being a larger framework here, and also what Manjula said earlier about the connection between science fiction and colonialism, right? And we, Manjula, you just presented this perspective that science fiction allows us to think beyond the self in a way. To take on other forms that we couldn't, that we don't have perhaps in a regular, in our regular lives. And I think, when we talk about global SF and when we talk about the origins in a way of science fiction, then the origins of science fiction are very closely linked to colonialism. They are, or at least the genre called science fiction is very closely linked to colonialism. John Reader has a book on this. Science fiction and the emergence of colonialism and the emergence of science fiction, and one of the things that it argues and is able to demonstrate very clearly that the aliens are us. That when we are talking about Anglophone SF, by and large, the construct that is coming out of Anglo-French SF, in those worlds, those aliens, they are very clearly anthropomorphized, most certainly. And one of the reasons they are is because this is the colonial context. It's actually us. H.G. Wells, in his classic narrative, War of the Worlds, states very clearly that this is an allegory of what the British did in Tasmania. He starts with that idea. So when we talk about speculation, and when we talk about science fiction, and when we talk about its origins, then I think its origins are quite problematic in many ways if we are looking at only, let's say, Anglophone origins or French origins of the genre. But if, and this is kind of where my own critical inquiry began, so my argument was, well, if this happened in the 19th century and if this was connected to colonialism, then colonialism happened everywhere around the world, so we will have similar literature around the world. So, and I started looking back, exploring this question historically. It most certainly exists in India. It exists in 19th century, many examples in there. It also exists in in what we would call Afrofuturism. So a lot of critics, Isaiah Lavender the third, for instance, has just brought out this book on the rise of Afrofuturism, and he's tracing this in the 19th century. Sherry Rennie Thomas's anthology Dark Matter has done this, and they have all traced this back to the 19th century and beyond. So, but the thing is this narrative science fiction? And this is where I think Anil's point becomes really important, that a lot of this would not be considered genre science fiction. The reason for that is that genre science fiction has come to be defined very much from an Anglophone lens, from an Anglophone and French lens, whereas speculation, which we might call a larger genre, exists everywhere. And a lot of this narrative has also to do with imagining futures. But they are imagining futures, but not as science fiction, but they are imagining futures. So Afrofuturism, a lot of critics, for instance, are explicit about stating that this is not science fiction. This is Afrofuturism. This is Black futures. This is Black speculative literature. So we need to be kind of like, when we unpack the generic framework, then a lot of these questions become much more difficult. And I agree with Anil that it is a different framework that we need.
Yeah, Manjula, you want to say something? Yeah, please.
I'd like to add to and also explore Bodhisattva's point to it's really more of a question. Would you say I'm going to just say discomfort with finding the kinds of fictions that you reference as being science fiction proper and so on? Is there, I'm going to rephrase this, is there an unwillingness to take center stage from amongst the populations that were once colonized? Are we actually always shrinking from putting ourselves in the position that the colonials once held? And it also brings up the difficulty of taking that position and then not slipping into various forms of unattractive racism or speciesism or, kind of reverse colonialism. And is the unwillingness to do that making it difficult for us to express a centered vision of both ourselves and of the populations around us and of the future?
Okay. So, Anil, okay, now this is, if you ask...
Keki wants to say something. Keki is interested in saying something. No, I don't, anyway.
Okay, Anil, so I be just, we just following upon what Bodhi said and Manjula added. So this, how do you think this speculative fiction in India, how it is being perceived?
How it's being perceived?
Yeah, more and more young writers are coming, especially boys and girls. They are easily into it. Because I just want to bring it to, just a couple of things, that what exactly is a science fiction. Like one person last year, he came with that, sir, I have just translated some 20-25 pages. It's a proper science fiction in Tamil by a writer called Jaya Mohan. So he brought 25 pages, and I said, okay. Luckily for him, one of the publishers came to my desk, and I just gave him. He came back after a week, and he said, first, don't you think, they have a severe feeling of deja vu. Maybe this person has copied. Okay, I didn't want to say anything. Maybe he doesn't know. Like Professor Manasi Lal is here. And she edited, and we published a book, an anthology of fantasy, fantasy writing in India. And it's such a wonderful book. It has a contribution from people across India. And when we are not yet published, printed, it has not come out of the press. And a boy and a girl came and said, no, sir, you know that we have some kind of a term, all these marks, professor is I want to do this, we are doing research, and I said, what do you want? Can you give me this dummy copy? I said, boss, it's uncorrected. No, we want to use it. Okay, they went and they vanished. They didn't come back for 3 months, 4 months. But the point is, when they returned after 3-4 months, they said, no, it looks like we all copied from West. So wait, I mean, so many people, yeah, so many languages, yeah, that's a kind of a perception among youngsters. What I'm trying to say is that youngsters are still believe that there is no original speculative fiction in India.
Yeah, they could be right. I would say that we have the 900-pound gorilla, which is American science fiction, right?
Yeah.
And it blasts continuous stream of Netflix, Amazon Prime, and so on. So that's the impression that you get of what science fiction or fantasy is about. And these are the same people who watch it, are the people who want to write that stuff. So a large component is going to be derivative. That is a given in, I think, in any form of literature. A lot of what we write in so-called mainstream literature is derivative based on, say, Virginia Woolf or T.S. Eliot or whatever, right? We write the kind of stuff that we have been grown up reading. So derivative by itself is not a problem, as long as it is you are doing the best you can, and it is interesting to read, right? But there are two kinds of things that I think our version of speculative fiction or science fiction or fantasy does bring to the table. That's a little different. And one of them is we have a certain sense of whimsy in our literature. So we poke fun at ideas of technology, at ideas of colonialism, at ideas of who is boss, who is not. So, for example, Ganada stories of Parmendra Mitra, they are whimsical. Shantida is whimsical, right? So whimsical science fiction is very, very common in parodies of Harishankar Parsai, for example, the satires, right? So you find that kind of thing is a little different from the stuff that you read in the West. And they're very popular. The Parsai was read by millions, right? So if you're looking at the urban English reader, he or she or they might be influenced by, they might feel it is derivative. But if they were to explore a little deeper, a little further into the literature, I think they would find that there are interesting things going on that are not at all typical, but it's very difficult to see at this stage because we are so close to the fire that we cannot really judge. Our criticisms, our judgments are not quite accurate. It'll take about, say, 50 years or 60 years before we can truly say whether the kind of stuff that we are doing now is different enough to be called a movement in itself. So what Samit is doing, the people who read Samit, when they write books, whether they were actually influenced to create a movement that they don't know they are part of. Today, for example, we talk of Bombay poets. But if you talk to actual Bombay poets, they'll say there was no such thing. We were not Bombay poets, right? But people have made them into Bombay poets because they happen to come from the city. So that kind of thing, whether will happen with Indian spec fic, remains to be seen. So I think reader impressions at this stage will necessarily be distorted. That's fine, because we'll know in about 50 years what the true state of affairs was.
Okay, we'll know only after 50 years. So I think Keki has just gone. So shall we open questions? Shall we start with the Professor Mala Shilal?
Right.
Yeah, I am unmuting them. Just wait.
I can't hear.
Wait. I think she is also pressing. Okay, I say unmute all. Okay, now, ma'am. No. I think she is also doing. Okay, now let her come back. Now, Vandana, can you please, you start.
Well, is there something, should I make a general comment or do you want
No, we'll just go for it.
Okay. Well, firstly, I must say it's a pleasure to be talking about science fiction. I've been feeling this hunger, throughout this very science fictional moment that we're living in. And it's lovely to see very dear old friends and potential new ones as well. Anil and I had long time ago when we were kind of young and innocent, considered what Indian science fiction might be, and in a rather reckless fashion. I think I interviewed Anil on that. Anil, you remember?
Yes.
Yeah. And I think we did a lot of speculating there. You know, we didn't at that time, I don't think either of us knew the history of Indian science fiction in regional languages. At least I didn't.
Yeah, same.
And, you know, and since then, it's been such a wonderful, wonderful discovery to know the history of, for instance, Bangla SF. And I still remember the first time I read Premendra Mitra, who wrote the Ghanada stories, I believe in the 1940s. And for the first time, I felt, wow, I can talk to my own people. You know, it was a very decolonizing moment because inevitably, even if you are set up, you know, to kind of write maybe anti-colonial science fiction or whatever, you're still reacting to the colonialists, right? Whereas, and so they're still the standard in some way. And it's not that I don't enjoy a lot of, you know, American and British science fiction, but again, I was looking for something else. The reason why I got into it was due to a different kind of search. And so I remember that moment of discovery and being able to write to your own people. And also later, when I realized that there was science fiction coming out of so many countries, that you could actually be influenced by, say, a science fiction writer from Argentina or from China or from the Philippines or something like that. And that was another heady moment that, you know, science fiction didn't have to be one kind of thing, and it didn't have to be owned by a nation or certain hemisphere. And so, you know, Indian science fiction in conversation with the world, especially in non-English languages, is something I'd love to see more of. And for me personally, it's not been, you know, I've just started exploring that. So I hope there are some good translators out there who are doing more translation.
So we have Francesco Verso with us, and he has already done his job.
Yes, indeed.
So he can facilitate the conversation. Professor Mala Shilal. Yeah.
Thank you. It's been a great pleasure to listen to all of you. And my question takes off from the previous one about Indian speculative fiction and how the familiar can be defamiliarized by being put into another imaginative zone, especially if it's located in the future or in non-specified space. And with my interest in gender, and I'm going back to what Manjula mentioned about language and gender, does speculative Indian science fiction have scope for being a literature of social change that uses Indian mythology? Because Indian mythology is an extremely potent social influence. Is it possible to pull it out of the past? There's a lot of fiction that is being written with using mythology, but is speculative fiction possible? Because it's very difficult to change the major narrative of those stories. I've worked on Radha Sita. It's very difficult to change the major narrative. But in speculative fiction, how much new induction can be brought in so that patriarchal hierarchies such as gender can actually be altered in that world of imagination?
Okay. So you want Manjula to answer that?
Oh, anyone.
Yeah, Manjula, please go ahead. Yeah.
I'd like to answer it for a very specific reason, which is that in both my two novels, that is the Escape and The Island of Lost Girls, I am exploring two speculative universes. In the first, that is Escape, the action takes place in an unnamed country where all the women have been destroyed, save for one little girl. And we experience her growing up as a little girl who comes into adulthood without ever having seen any women. From that, the next book, that is The Island of Lost Girls, we enter the story through the persona of a man who is he's, I would say, dressed as a woman. He looks like a woman, but he is not a transgender woman because he has not chosen to be wearing a woman's body. He has been forced into it for reasons to do with the plot. Now, for me as a writer, it was an extraordinary exploration of otherness, not just of a character who would be similar to myself, that is a woman experiencing, in this case, a very unfamiliar world outside the country of origin, but the world through the perceptions of a man who looks like a woman. And science fiction offers us that freedom. I'm going to stop because I could go on for a long time.
Yeah,
so
yeah.
I'm going to stop. But
Yeah, from there I'm going to Bodhi. Bodhi, that, you know, this particular question arises some maybe 20 years ago, 25 years ago, I don't remember. I read a book, fiction about a world completely controlled by artificial intelligence. It was revolutionary at the time, maybe 30 years ago. So this kind of language use. So as Manjula says, it offers freedom to us. So, I mean, how do you think it will go on as more and more days to come? Sorry.
I would actually go back to the question of gender and bring up a short story by the Bengali writer Parashuram or Rajshekhar Bosu. He wrote under the pen name of Parashuram.
That's a book.
Very famous short story writer, and he wrote this short story called Mangalik or the Martian from 1955, where he does precisely this. So these Martians don't have gender. Right, and he's able to do this also because Bangla as a language doesn't have that. It doesn't have gendered pronouns, right? So unlike something like Hindi, for instance, right, where you would distinguish. So Bangla doesn't have that, and he uses that in a way as an idea. So these Martians come, and it's a satire. He was a satirist, and he takes that questioning even further by saying that, well, you know, you may not have that in language, but what about your dress, right? What about your, your clothing habits, for instance, right? So there are ways to explore even this question of gender, but it depends also on what kind of universe we inhabit as well. So if our language doesn't have that sense of gender, then, and if we want to create a speculative universe where we are exploring the issue of gender, then we can't do it via language. We have to do it in some other ways. But science fiction has been proposing many different kinds of experiments with gender. Ursula Le Guin's narrative, Left Hand of Darkness, is a famous example. More recently, Anne Leckie's trilogy, Ancillary Justice, Ancillary Mercy, and so on, they do the same, in which you have these artificial intelligences once again. In fact, if we are going back 25 years, then it might be Greg Egan's novel Diaspora, which I think is from 1995.
Correct, exactly.
Where you have the same idea, and I think that narrative uses Spivak pronouns. I think Viz, Bur, and so on. So science fiction has done this a lot. It has played with this notion of gender and gendered pronouns. But I think it's also a question of where we evolve as beings. So what would we call our robot, for instance? Would we?
Yeah, that was my question. I mean, extending from Manjula's observation. Yeah.
We don't know. We try to anthropomorphize everything, but I think science fiction has given us models of saying that, oh, you don't have to do that. You don't have to look at everything from.
Yeah, correct. So Anil, that I mean exactly. So so long as it remains science fiction is fine, but when it becomes science fantasy, probably that is where gender neutral is not possible.
So the question is, in science fantasy, gender neutrality is not possible?
I'm asking, yeah.
Why?
No, I do not think so. Yeah. I think in science fantasy, the main rule is realism, adherence to science, what's possible in science. That's broken. So you are able to bring in kind of a magical science.
Okay.
But in terms of the problems it deals with, it is, you could find the same things being discussed, except that the world's context is a little different. The rules of the world are a little different. The way you would go at building the world would be a little different. But the basic issues would not, the things you're interested in would not change all that much.
Okay. Just a moment, Vandana wants to make an observation. Yeah, please.
Just very quickly, I just want to point out on the question of science fiction and gender and so-called mythology. Anil can speak to it also through a book we co-edited, although Anil did about 3/4 of it, which was called Breaking the Bow, which are stories inspired by the Ramayana.
Yeah, I
And
remember that. Yeah.
they take off in very, very, very different and interesting directions. So I just wanted to mention
Yeah.
that.
I think KK sir is waiting for long. Sir, KK, you want to ask question earlier you raised?
No.
I think he's up. I think he's.
I'm not sure that we can hear him.
Yeah. Now I unmuted. So yeah, please go ahead, sir.
हाँ लगा दो.
Right. Oh, he's gone now.
He's gone, I think. Okay. Fine. So I think we are running short of time. We have only 4 minutes, one by one. First, we'll start with Manjula. Quick thought, quick word.
Quick word is the future is for us to build on, and to make of it what we want, rather than be handed a set of rules that we've got from different kinds of pasts. I'll just stop there.
Yeah. Okay. Great. So Bodhi.
You know, I'm just, yeah, it's just an honor to be here. That's my word here with you know, both Anil and Vandana have been my teachers at the first Indian science fiction workshop. So yeah, it's just a pleasure to be here. That's all I can say. And Professor Mala Srilal, of course, when I was at DU. So yeah, that's my word here.
Anil.
Yeah, thanks,
Let's
Bodhi.
split out.
Thank you all for coming. It's been a pleasure, and I would say that I would think of speculative fiction as literature of the imagination, and where the imagination goes, so there we go, and join the ride.
Yeah. Okay, where the imagination goes, we go. Okay, so thank you, Manjula, Bodhi, Anil, and Francisco. Tarun, actually, Tarun, we are unable to see your face. Thank you very much for joining us. Vandana Singh, Professor Mala Srilal, hey sir, all of you. And it is such a wonderful discussing with all of you. And people around the world, please continue to watch Sahitya Akademi's program in all the 24 languages. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rajmohan.
Thank you, Rajmohan.
Bye.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye,
Bye.
everyone.
Bye.
Bye.